All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Susan Versen, and I am the head of reference here at Massanutten Regional Library. I am happy to welcome you to this afternoon's author talk with Suzanne Woods Fisher, who will talk about her new book, The Moonlight School and the Seriousness of America's Literacy Problem. First, a few brief previews, and then I will introduce our speaker. We have two upcoming author talks in April. First is Thursday, April 22nd at 7 p.m. with author Glenn Frankel, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, who will discuss his new book, Shooting Midnight Cowboy. Then on Thursday, April 20th, author Andrew Marinis will talk about his book, Singled Out, The True Story of Glenn Burke. Burke is the inventor of the high five and also the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. Again, all these programs will be presented live via Zoom. Pre-register by visiting mrlib.org. Just want to give everybody a reminder that all 7 branches of Massanutten Regional Library are now open for browsing, and we are hosting the Celebrating Sims exhibit about local educator Lucy F. Sims at our central branch until the end of April. A few Zoom housekeeping tips. This is a webinar format, so you will not see yourself. You'll only see the speakers, the panelists, which will be me and Suzanne today. And attendees will also remain muted. But as you think of questions during the program, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I will share them with Suzanne. And now let me introduce today's speaker. Suzanne Woods Fisher is an award-winning best-selling author of more than 30 books, including On a Summer Tide and On a Coastal Breeze, as well as The Nantucket Legacy, Amish Beginnings, The Bishop's Family, The Deacon's Family, and The Inn at Eagle Hill series, among other novels. She is also the author of several nonfiction books about the Amish, including Amish Peace and Amish Proverbs. She currently lives in California. So, Suzanne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, good. So, and I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm really envious your libraries are open because ours are still kind of just a door cracks open and we can get a book and drop a book, but not browse yet. So good for you guys. Glad it's working well. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully this will work well. I just need to expand it. So there. Hopefully that looks good. Okay, and this is going to be a presentation about a very ordinary woman who led a very extraordinary life. And it's really a story that belongs to all of us. It's a little known story in US history. Cora Wilson Stewart was a woman who was born in 1875 in Rowan County, Kentucky. And her father was a physician. Her mother was a teacher. So she was raised in a home that valued education, and she eventually became a teacher. And then she ran for the superintendent of education in her county. And keep in mind, she was the very first female superintendent, and this was in a time before women actually even had the vote. So you're starting to get a shape, just an understanding of this is a woman who's a little bit, pushes the boundaries a bit. So she had this idea of opening up the schoolhouses, rural schoolhouses she was responsible for. She had 51 of them, opening them up on moonlit nights to illiterate adults. And she hoped that maybe 150 would come on that first night. And to her surprise, over 1,200 people, ages 18 to 86, mothers with babies, old men, out of the hills and the hollows, you can almost visualize it, to learn how to read and write in these little schoolhouses. Just a remarkable story. And you might wonder, if I suspect you haven't heard about it, I'll be interested in maybe even put in the chat room if you've ever heard of Moonlight Schools, because most people never have. And there's kind of an interesting story of how it kind of came into my life in such a tiny little way. But I was actually, I rise early in the morning and I hit a word count every day. I'm a really disciplined writer. And as I write, I listen to a classical music station. And there was this one morning, and it must have been September 5th, when the radio host, in sort of this beautiful baritone voice, mentioned just very casually, today in history, the Moonlight School's grassroots movement began in 1911, led by Cora Wilson Stewart. And there was something about that that just made me stop and dig and Google and study it a little bit and try to understand a little bit more. And with that, I I took it to my editor and just said, am I wrong, or is this a story just waiting to be told? Because I think it's a pretty amazing, remarkable story of what woman has done. Give you a picture. On the left-hand side are some of the rural schoolhouses. The bottom one is on the campus of Morehead State University in Rowan County, Kentucky now, and you could actually go and visit there. But I followed a hunch. I just wanted to kind of give you a little background on both this story and then how it came for me to be the author of Moonlight Schools. So anyway, it wasn't long before my editor actually gave me a contract for this book, and that's how it began. So let's look at Rowan County, Kentucky. You can see the red. It's the eastern part of Kentucky, Appalachia. It is very mountainous, isolated hills and hollows. One thing distinctive about it, it's lumber, not coal. So much of Kentucky is coal, but this is a that beautiful old virgin timber in the 1890s was harvested out, and lumber was still sort of part of its history, but not coal. Very poor region, subsistence farmers. One of the things I do as I write historical fiction is I study the census of the time. So I studied the US Census in 1910, and the illiteracy rate of all of the United States at that time was 7.7%. And that was about 5.5 million people couldn't read or write their name in any language whatsoever. Kentucky's illiteracy rate in the same time was 12.1%, so almost 2/3 more. Rowan County was well over 25%. Most estimated to be about 1/3 of the county had illiterate adults. And again, very isolated, people who did not particularly take kindly to a government agent knocking on their door asking questions. So really, it is generally about that point. Now, one thing kind of interesting, in 1911, where our story begins, there was the thinking of academics believed that adults could not learn to read or write. It was a window in childhood when your mind opened, and when that window closed, so did the opportunity to learn. Cora believed this as well. This was just the accepted thinking of the time. And then she had 3 moments with mountain people that really upended her thinking and challenged it. And I wove these into the story as well. It's just such a powerful moments for her. The first circumstance involved a woman named Molly Mclaughlin. That's not really her, but it's kind of what I think she would look like. So she was an older woman, bent with age, kind of lived way up in the hills. And she would come into Cora's office in town to have Cora read her letters. She had a daughter, Jane, who lived in Chicago. And when Jane would write, Molly would have Cora read her letters and then dictate one in return so that she could keep in communication with Jane. And then there was this one day when Molly came into town and Cora asked her if she wanted her to read a letter or write a letter. And Molly said, no, I've done it myself. I've learned how to read and write. She actually bought herself a primer, stayed up throughout the nights, probably took her quite a long time, and taught herself how to read. And her very first letter was to her daughter, Jane. That just kind of shocked Cora, I think. And the second incident happened a few months after that with a mountain man. Again, this is just a visual to give you a picture of the kinds of people that were up in Rowan County. And this happened when a gentleman came into Cora's office, and he was waiting for her to finish something at her desk. And she had a row of bookshelves off to the side, and she noticed that he was looking at the bookshelves. And she offered to loan him a book because books were sort of rare in Rowan County. And he turned to her with tears in his eyes and said, I would give 20 years of my life if I could read or write a single book. He too was illiterate. Well, a short time after that, Cora went to a school function, and there was this young man singing a beautiful ballad. And you know how music and country music is so important to the South and to Appalachia. And Cora was so touched by the wording and the poetry. and the lyrics and the sort of the power of this ballad that she went up to him after and asked for a copy of it because she wondered if she couldn't get it published. And this man turned to her and he said, I have hundreds of songs like that, but they're all stuck in my head. I can't read or write. And he certainly couldn't read music. Those 3 moments kind of just gave Cora, almost broke through her acceptance of the academic thinking of the time and made her think more, well, wait a minute, what if they could? And that was how she came up with the idea of Moonlight Schools. But before I get quite to the Moonlight Schools, I want to jump back into the writer's seat for a moment. I told you sort of the basic bones of the story, and I don't mind that you know that I'm not giving away the spoiler. I fictionalized the whole story, so it's sort of a, it has a lot more characters and things going on and plot lines. But the basic bones of it is just such a wonderful story. How was I going to turn that into an 85,000 word novel, though? And here's some of the ways that I found to do that. One is, I'm sorry, I missed a screen. This is, so Cora set to work on the idea of Moonlight Schools. But here I'm back into how to expand it. Sorry about that. I added some new slides and forgot to make notes. How do you expand it? I learned something new. I love this about writing. I think this is the most enjoyable part of writing, is when you're curious about something and you can just go and start learning and learning and learning. Well, I knew music was an important and a deep tradition in Appalachia, but what I didn't know was about singing school masters. And that is a tradition that came out of New England in the 1700s. And it's a little bit like itinerant preachers that would go through in the autumn, because America was an agrarian society, and they would come through in the autumn time when the farmers had time to spare, sort of, a little more time. And they would set up either like a tent gathering, or in this case, it was what we call brush arbors. And they would actually teach people, they would come in the evenings and they would teach them how to sing. Or they would teach them new words or new music. Or one of the ways they had pamphlets was something called shape note notation. And those might be familiar to many of you because they're sort of common to identify the different notes, but this was particularly helpful for working with illiterate people so that everyone could sing. And the singing schoolmaster would stand in the center of they would bring benches around him, and he would be in the center and he'd sing out a line, and that group would sing, and then he'd turn and the other sing out another line, and they would sing, turn again, another line and another line. And this was entertainment in the 17 and 1800s. I mean, it's just something, sort of a beautiful sense of community and learning and all. Another example of how to expand into a novel was using mountain talk. And all of you obviously are probably great readers, and you've read dialect in books. It is a tricky thing to put dialogue in because it can be overdone, and it's very distracting when it's overdone. It can be ineffective if it's underdone, because it's a wonderful opportunity to really stretch and bring color and life to a book. And it can be just plain annoying too. Well, one thing kind of fun was I learned as I studied the mountain dialect that many of the language actually comes out of the 1400s in the UK, in either England, Scotland, and Ireland, from the time of Chaucer. I thought one thing I loved about discovering that is because I think we have a bias toward some of the language of Appalachia to almost seem ignorant or uneducated. But interestingly enough, it isn't. It's just the opposite. Let me see if you recognize any of these. Afeared is a term for afraid. In fact, I have a friend from Texas who uses that phrase all the time. She's afeared of something. A mite as a little. I think we all use that. Book read, meaning educated. Nothing never stop, something unending, like the pandemic. And then there's invented out of thin air words that are sort of fun too. And these would not necessarily be the time of Chaucer, but they are just part of pinpointing where this book was written. Sigogling. I have some friends in Kentucky who use the term, like if a wall's not straight, it's a sigoggle wall. Jasper is a stranger. Gom means all cluttered up. I just find language so fascinating because it's constantly changing. And when it's isolated like that, you just get a window into another century. Well, Cora's working along on this idea. We're jumping back to Cora Wilson Stewart, sorry, and into the Moonlight Schools. And her ideas are starting to take shape. She knows exactly what she wants to do. She wants to use time really wisely. And she knows these are farming people. They are tired by the end of the day. So she starts and ends on time. I'm going to give you a class schedule of how she works right now. Monday through Thursday, starts on time, ends on time. It's 2 6-week sessions. She had, very specific time of singing and reading and writing and arithmetic and drills, and then it would end. And one thing that she just drilled into her students or into her teachers. And one thing to keep in mind is most of these teachers in these 51 rural schoolhouses were teenagers themselves. Most of them had gone through the schools and had graduated 8th grade and were now moving into maybe a little bit of high school, but there's a phrase that the way you can tell who was the teacher and who was the student is that the teacher wore shoes. They're young people and they had been teaching children all day long, but they volunteered their time in the evening to teach the adults. Again, really trained them to give positive feedback on every single effort. Because one thing Cora wanted to do, she wanted to respect the pride of the mountain people. She grew up there. She knew what it was like. She created very relevant reading materials, things that were, useful to farmers, newspapers that she created about the weather, about crops, about tips for farming and gardening. As she really expanded and the Moonlight Schools expanded, she even created books. This is a country life reader. Here was something more specific, a mother's first book. And then even more specifically, a soldier's first book. So she was not trying to have them start at school as a child with a primer. She was really respecting where they were in life. And at the end of the sessions, amazingly, Moonlight Schools were able to sign their own name, which is something I think we so take for granted, how powerful a moment that would have been in a person's life, to not just write an X any longer, but to sign a document with your own name. Basic arithmetic, to write simple letters to people, to write a verse of the Bible. And this is the most exciting thing of all. Graduation marked the move from illiteracy to what Cora called a functional literacy. And there was this phrase by an older man who said, "Moonlight Schools has taken my community from moonshine and bullets to lemonade and Bibles." It was incredibly successful. And this is what I just felt astounded by. In 2 years, adult illiteracy was virtually wiped out in Rowan County. Remember, over a third of the population was illiterate. 2 years later, which is just astounding. And this immense success of the program spread on throughout Kentucky, then into a lot of the southern states, then onto Native American reservations, and throughout the West. It became the model for adult literacy education and is really essentially for adult night schools. There was one estimate that said within the first 20 years of the Moonlight Schools program in Kentucky, over 700,000 Kentuckians came to the Moonlight Schools. Just amazing. Well, and the rest of Cora's life was defined by being an advocate of literacy. That was just her passion. One thing I didn't mention earlier on about Cora is that she was actually divorced 3 times, twice to the same man. And there was a point in her life prior to the Moonlight Schools when she decided that her passion would not be in a relationship at home, but it was going to be in her work. And she threw everything into her work. So she received national and international recognition for her work throughout her life. She chaired the NEA Committee on Illiteracy, and she was also chair of President Herbert Hoover's Commission on Illiteracy. So Cora had this dream to eliminate illiteracy in one generation. And I love her big dreams. It is remarkable. She didn't quite hit that target, and we'll find out more in a moment on that. But she had really very few people in history have had the impact on education and literacy like Cora Wilson Stewart. Just astounding. She died in 1959 at the age of 83. Sort of a sad story too, because she ended up becoming blind as she in her later years. But one thing I feel about Cora is her legacy is this idea that she made a difference in the community where she lived and then beyond. But it started small. It started with what she knew. And I think that is such a powerful thing to end on. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. She did not stop at the end. And I think that is so important for all of us, because you would think that statistics in a wealthy nation as ours, that we would be really taking Cora Wilson Stewart's dream and eliminating illiteracy to the best of our ability. And the sad thing is that it's almost the exact opposite. We are now at a 21% rate of Americans are functionally illiterate, which means they're not able to read a newspaper or a medicine bottle. It's a really concerning statistic. And I think when I finished this novel and I started studying about statistics, I am just shocked at where things are in our country. And I know we have a lot of problems in our country, but I think reading is probably one of the most powerful ways to help lift people. One of the things that concerns me so much is the prison population, for example. 3 out of 5 people in prison can't read, and 85% of youth offenders struggle to read. 61% of low-income families have no children's books in their home. If parents can't read well, they're not going to have books in their home. It is a worry. And yet, Cora, I think, taught us this. There's a phrase in the literacy world called each one teach one. And I think Cora Wilson Stewart just did a beautiful example of that in giving us just little ideas of ways to make a difference. And again, she started small. She started with what she knew. I think we can do that too. For example, every time you are reading a book, you are modeling the value of reading. When you read to your children, your grandchildren, when you donate school or books to schools, volunteering at a public library. I have some friends who, when pre-pandemic, they give about an hour a week to the public library. One of my friends works with a Chinese immigrant from the mainland China who has an MBA and yet struggles in English, being fluid in English. And so my friend works with him each week on just conversation, just sort of building those skills. I think that's just a wonderful idea, joining a book club. I have a little free library out in front of my house, which is so fun. I put it up probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's just a wonderful way for a book sharing, just a great way to kind of, it's like a little neighborhood watering hole, and I just love it. I think volunteering to help is so significant. Supporting local teachers. I have 4 kids. I feel like I did a good job. I think I could have done a better job at supporting teachers, especially now that my daughter's a teacher. And we can't do enough to just give the gift of reading. Just such a powerful thing. And I think sometimes we just take it for granted what it is and what it means. But it is quite a gift. So with that, I'm going to now hand back the screen. And there we go. Hello. And I think I better get my dog in. I will be right back. I'm so sorry, but she's barking.
Take my mask off. So yes, we are very excited to be able to let people in our buildings again. So everybody come visit us.
Oh, sorry. Real life always interferes. No matter what I do, something happens. The doorbell rings. Sorry.
It's the beauty and It's the beauty of Zoom programming
Yeah.
is the spontaneity, if you will. So
Well, just rolling with it. It's sort of, I've seen with a lot of newscasters that don't realize they're on and things like that. It's sort of funny.
exactly. So I know we have some questions coming in, but my question was, did you ever? So it looks like you got to visit Kentucky and Rowan County.
So I feel like there is something I sort of was humbled by in this book, because I have always gone to where I am writing when I've done any kind of contemporary or historical. It's just, and I think I've been almost a little bit arrogant about it, because I do feel there's nothing like original sourcing. There's nothing like knowing what the air smells like in the sky and how the light changes and the terrain and the, foliage and everything. And I had a trip so perfectly planned, so perfect. I mean, down to the minute of meeting the academics I had spoken with, going to the schoolhouse, going to this, and boom, the country hit lockdown. And it was, it kind of, I then worked even probably harder in looking at every documentary I could find, talking to friends who live in Kentucky, communicating back again with these academics who had done their PhDs on Cora. But sadly, I have not been in that schoolhouse yet, and I'm going to get there. I'm hoping in the fall that I will get there and post a lot of pictures on my blogs. But it kind of was a humbling thing, because I really do believe in original sourcing, and I believe in authors doing their homework. I think it's so important. But this has just been one of those years. Everything planned.
So how did you research? How did you even go about like tackling this like in an orderly way?
Well, I should show you my books. I have
stacks
and stacks of books. There's a number of biographies on Cora Wilson Stewart. And I did speak to 2 books were written by people who did their PhDs on her. So I did have that. And there was a lot of little details that they gave me. For example, she had a taste for finer things. And so she had a beautiful Oriental rug in her office, and she had an ornate partner's desk and 2-sided, and little details like that, the bookshelves that were full, that I just had fun kind of weaving into the story to make it more true to what, it hopefully was like.
The singing master character, how did you research him specifically?
Well, I had those 3 aha moments for Cora kind of helped me create characters for the book. And I wanted to have this young man, the musician, and how to create a story. And I actually, in my mind, I have this idea of Johnny Cash as a young man. That kind of craggy face and the little seriousness, and yet the tenderness and that beautiful voice he has. And so that's how I started expanding on, how do I take a musician and how would I put him in there and place him in there? And I stumbled on singing school masters. That was sort of, I think it was maybe studying shape note notation that led me to the singing school masters, because this was how they made their money, was selling the pamphlets of the shape note notation.
Okay. So let's see, we have another question. Is there a specific story that you came across that stood out to you about the Moonlight schools?
A story meaning like
a specific, like somebody maybe who attended one, like did you get any stories about the people who actually went to the schools?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. I was actually researching old videos, and I found one of a teacher at the Moonlight School, and she was describing back. So she was probably a teenager at the time, and she was an older woman now, quite a bit older. It was like a grainy black and white. It was probably done in the 50s. And she made this comment at the end that she said, it was the highlight of my life. And I never forgot that. I thought of that, and I just felt like, oh, that is so powerful.
Okay, let's see what else we have. All right. Can you talk a little bit about how the Moonlight schools affected the literacy movement nationally? I know you touched on that a little bit, but how did this movement, how big an impact did the movement make nationally outside of Kentucky?
I think it was a very significant one, first through Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And Cora eventually became the superintendent of education for the entire state.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
And then it did spread south. And I think it was Alabama and then sort of heading west and into especially like Native American reservations.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this was all grassroots, all volunteer. There was no government money. And I think it continued to spread as World War I came in. And that's probably when the first Soldiers book, when she wrote that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was a lot, anytime, of course, the world wars have probably altered the shape of everything, you know, and the exposure and the needs and things like that. But I think there was probably a significant movement, even to the point where I have read that the civil rights in the 50s and the 60s based a lot of some of their same tenets in some of the way Cora Wilson Stewart had developed the movement, her grassroots movement. So I think it was really profound, and yet I love that it was all volunteer. I love that it kind of went around.
So there was no like national organization that organized it or ran it. Did it get tied into the progressive movement? Was this something that would fall into that category when we talk about the progressive movement with the Moonlight schools?
In the
be
30s
part of that?
And 40s,
Yeah.
From what I understand, now she was cheering Herbert Hoover's. I think there were some issues that came into her life that kind of did not give her quite as much traction in the 30s and the 40s as she had in those earlier decades.
Yeah.
At least when in the national scene. So
okay. That was just I was like, oh, this sounds like a progressive movement, you know, like something that they would pick up on. Can you talk a little bit about Lucy Wilson, that character, and the inspiration for her, and how you created her, I guess.
So back to the book, Lucy, actually, let me go back 1 second. You were talking about progressive movements. Have you ever heard of a term called uplift? That was a phrase that was used a lot among some of the writings that I read about Cora Wilson Stewart. And it was really kind of a term used, I think actually had more to do with women and the movement of women coming in with the vote and that kind of thing. And so there was a lot, and I wish I had a clearer answer for you, but I think there's so many parts of society changing and opening up, and that I love that kind of term uplift. I just think that's so much. Okay, Lucy Wilson was a character I created to offset Cora because I really wanted to keep Cora somewhat untouched. I didn't want to put words in her mouth that I didn't feel she would have said. I didn't want to alter her life. I wanted to kind of really stay to the bones of her life. And every book needs a love story, and they really do. I mean, there's not many books that don't have, even war books and all, that don't have a love story. I just felt that I needed to respect that about her and not change that. But Lucy was a wonderful way of she was a young woman, a second cousin to Cora, fictitious. She'd been raised in Lexington, kind of a sheltered home life, refined, very unaware of how to cope with the poverty that she was exposed to in Appalachia. Cora and her father kind of pushed her into accepting a position as helping Cora. She came in thinking she'd just stay at that partner's desk and write and take notes. And Cora got her on a pony and up into the hills and hollows, and a lot of amusing events happened. I used Lucy, besides a love story, there's sort of a love triangle in the novel for her. I do something with my Amish books as well, where I'll bring in a non-Amish character, and you can actually start to see from the outside in. You can look at a culture that's distinctive. And so that's a little bit what Lucy was coming in. And in the Amish, I call it kind of getting past the bonnets and buggies and beards to see, what are they really like? What makes them the way they are? Same with Lucy in Appalachia. Her first encounter was in Molly McLaughlin's cabin with a dirt floor and chickens roaming inside. And And she was horrified. And then little by little, you see her get past some of that initial poverty to realize the beauty of the culture, of the foods, the language, the music, the way they cared for each other and took care of each other. And I loved using that. So that was where the character
Okay.
kind of came in as a vehicle.
Okay. See, we have a question. You talk about the issue of illiteracy. What other ways do you think people can help encourage literacy outside of volunteering that you had already mentioned? So other ways that people can help combat illiteracy, which is, still an issue today.
I know it is such an issue, and it's not something that you can kind of say, well, that's why, or that's
Mhm.
why, or that's why. It's really multi-pronged, and I don't know how to attack it other than using Cora's idea that sort of start where you are.
Mhm.
And well, another friend, for example, volunteers at a women's shelter, and she's tutoring the children that are there with their moms. There's
Mhm.
just so many, and I know they asked me how not to do the volunteering. I feel like I don't know how to answer that without getting into political bunny trails, and all. But I think the whole idea of valuing our teachers, valuing what they can, what
Mhm.
they're bringing to our kids, it's really important. I think it is like the keystone of our country is education, and to not take it for granted, that's for sure.
I really enjoyed the part of the book where Cora talks about the importance of literacy as not just the reading, but without the ability to read and write, they have no voice. Um, is that directly from her, that quote
That
or that
well,
section?
it's not actually from her, but it is from a another old books I found that was about a man who traveled to remote parts of the world trying to bring their language into trying to actually put their language down from an oral tradition into
Mhm.
words. And that was one of the things he wanted to do. And he too was into literacy and the power of literacy. And I never forgot that people have no voice. They
Mhm.
really have no voice when you can't read and write. And it's hard for us to imagine that in this day and age.
Right. And that ties into the she tied it, or you tie it specifically in the book, to the ability to vote, to have your voice heard by your representatives, and be an active participant in your community, in your world. And I thought that was one of them. I just kind of stopped at that point and went,
Thank you.
oh. So I really like that. So I want to make sure I
Thank
told you that.
you.
Um, do you know how long did the Moonlight schools last, and did the Depression have an effect on them?
Well, that's a good question. I think they probably, and I guess I don't have a specific answer, and I
Mhm.
really should have because it's a great question. I think World War One probably interrupted quite a lot,
Mhm.
and then when they picked up again, it might have been in a different category or a different way. But I know they lasted at least 20 some years,
Okay.
and then literacy kind of was took a different look. But it's a good question. I should have the answer. Sorry, I was so
Well,
focused on this time period. I think
yeah.
I'm probably it's just vast. It's a
Mhm.
vast thing.
Yeah, it is. Um, let's see. Uh, in your research, did you find that the whole community changed after the adults learned to read and write?
I think that too would be a really interesting next book. And it's not, it's a standalone, but
Yeah.
I think that would be an incredible thing to study more of
Mhm.
how things started to change and happen. And I don't have a specific answer, but I'm sure it made such a difference in how people were exploited,
Mhm.
especially in a poor area. I took the story of like lumber companies coming in and
Right.
having people sign, and they were given cash. And they didn't understand what they'd
Mhm.
given away. Um,
Right.
so, but that would be kind of fun to explore more of just like what difference did it make? I wish it could
Yeah.
say it was a magic button, but I'm sure it made life, better and better and better. And
Well, you have that quote about changing from moonshine to I can't remember what,
yeah,
to Bibles and lemonade. So
yeah.
um, somebody thought something changed. So whether they thought it was for the better, or if it was a huge community change, That would be hard to get, I imagine, without, you'd have to have their voices somehow. So with the pandemic, was the research harder because you couldn't go there? And did you use I mean, it looks like you used a lot of online resources from the local university, Morehead State, right? Correct?
Yeah,
Morehead
Morehead
State.
State
Okay.
is sort of like, that's where it all began
Okay.
in Morehead. It
Hmm.
wasn't a university at that
State.
time at
Okay.
all. It was where Cora went and it was kind of a normal college and got her teaching and education, and then it grew and grew,
Okay.
Morehead State. So that's sort of like the heart of it. That's the heart of the Moonlight. And I had one reader who wrote and said, I went to Morehead State, I passed that little schoolhouse, I never knew what it was for. It's funny how we just don't realize what's right in our midst.
No.
But was it harder during the pandemic? I think it was. It really was disappointing to me that I had not been able to be there, and I literally was days away. So it was heartbreaking, really hard. But I also feel like I did the best I could with the circumstances that I could, and I did feel like I turned over maybe every stone. Maybe in some ways I even felt a little worried about it, even went to the greater lengths just to make sure I had the right trees in the hills and the right birds in the trees and all that.
And I assume, is there like an archive dedicated to her there, specifically to her papers? I mean, like, were her papers collected and kept?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking of the school schedule. That was fascinating, that you have teenagers teaching their grown-ups. And did you find anything in any of the research about how the teachers felt about teaching the adults? You allude to it a little bit in the book about how they were a little worried about it. But did you find anything specific about how they felt about teaching their elders in the community?
Well, one thing that was kind of fun was you have that basic story of just how, she expected 150 to come and 1,200 came.
Yeah.
Just like, that's such a headliner. But what's interesting is there wasn't a lot of conflict for her.
Okay.
I actually put it into the book, imagining, I've got to have some pushback, because I'm sure not everybody wanted them to be able to read. I'm sure there was some people taking advantage or having at an advantage to have people. So all of the teachers were all on board with her. And I think that's a little bit, there was I have one teacher who stepped out. That was just fictitious. Really, every single one was right there with her. And I think that's a testimony to Cora Wilson Stewart and her charismatic personality, her sense of belief and dreams. And I mean, imagine 2 6-week sessions in the fall as it's getting darker and colder, and you're tired. I mean, even if you're 19 years old, you're tired by the end of the day.
Yeah.
And yet they did it and they loved it. So.
Okay. So we have somebody asked, so I know this is a standalone, so they want to know what you're working on next.
Oh, great question. Yeah. I have a couple books coming out this year.
Okay.
The third, in fact, just in another month or two, is a third book in a series that's a contemporary women's fiction, and it's called At Lighthouse Point. Third in a series about 3 sisters, and they each take a turn as the main character. And I love this series. It's very different, really fun, and yet kind of like it's off the coast of Maine, and in a kind of quirky community, a lot of local residents, and then you have the tourists that come in with their big ideas. And it's a fun book. I've loved how it's going. So that's coming out pretty soon. What I'm working on, though, is a book you might find interesting, and it's going to come out next year. It's set in Cape Cod in the summer. These are all summer. It's never cold. And it's about an ice cream shop. And my husband is actually an ice cream maker. He's even been at Penn State University to their ice cream school. They have one. In the month of January, they have ice cream school, for obvious reasons, held in January. And so I'm doing a lot of research.
What's your favorite flavor of research, I guess, is the question.
Well, something kind of curious about making ice cream, and I'm talking about really artisan ice cream, is that vanilla is so pure, it's the most difficult flavor to make. So, because chocolate will mask,
Mm-hmm.
Coffee add-ins will mask flavor,
Mm-hmm.
but not vanilla. And so my husband, being a serious guy, in fact, we call his ice cream Steve's Serious Ice Cream. He takes ice cream seriously and he's a serious guy. And he has made vanilla 59 times.
Oh, wow.
I know. I know.
Just yep, you just don't think of vanilla, but yes, I mean that's always been the thing is like you have to chase people's vanilla to find out how good the ice cream shop is.
Yes.
So, okay. What do you think post-pandemic life will be like for authors? Do you think the pandemic will have changed people's process, or will it have changed your process?
Not the original sourcing. I'm
Hmm.
dying to get back and just be where I'm writing about. Um, in fact, one of the things I love when I am researching is going into these little, like especially historical fiction, into like little museums that are
Hmm.
and finding books you don't find anywhere else. I mean, there is such a wealth of information in this country, and it's so much fun to be there and really dig through it. But how will it change? I can't help but think Zoom will probably be part of our daily life in the sense like I've been able to do a book tour through so many different
Hmm.
states because of this and get to places I really wouldn't have the budget for, the travel budget.
Hmm.
And yet I've loved it. And especially smaller rural libraries that
Hmm.
don't have as much going on. I mean,
Yeah.
it's such a privilege to be able to be, in way out there, or even on some book clubs that are tucked in little. There was one in Kentucky that meant a lot to me,
Oh.
that I probably wouldn't have been able to do. So there's always silver linings. I think we've learned a lot. It's probably sped things up more than anything else.
Yeah, I think your point about being able to travel is important because not everything is digitized.
Mhm.
So there's only so far you can go. And smaller libraries, like we have a small genealogy collection and it's not digitized. So, some of the things we have you can't find anywhere else.
Mhm.
So those kind of sources are still out there, but you do have to come visit them.
Yeah, nothing like face to face.
Yes. Are there anything else you want to share with our viewers? I don't even yeah. I don't see them. I don't see you. I'm sorry.
No,
Um,
just that I am really grateful. I know there's a lot of good books out there, and so I'm so thankful that you consider reading mine, and hope it's worth your read. And I did the very best I could. I feel as if that basic story again of the Moonlight Schools, and I feel like you could have given that same story, just that, to 5 different authors and say, come
mhm,
back in a year with a book. And there probably would have been 5 different stories that could
mhm,
have really expanded on it. And so
mhm.
I don't feel like I'm the best author in the world. I just feel like I worked really hard at trying to present a really good story. And I hope I was true to Cora Wilson Stewart. I also hope that literacy is just something that our minds are a little more open to,
Mhm.
the gift of reading and the importance of it, and just the fact that every time you're reading to your children and grandchildren, that you're doing a little bit of Cora's work. You're passing that on in a good way.
Do you think or why do you think she isn't as well known, actually? Because
Oh,
this was the first time I'd heard of her, and I was terribly I was like, how do I not know about this person?
oh, I agree with you. That I'm going to have to find that out, because I don't know why we don't have like a Cora Wilson Stewart Day or something.
Yeah, I just in literacy movements, and maybe I just am
Yeah.
not involved in the right groups. But I was like, I have not, or if I had heard of her, it was in passing, and it didn't, I didn't have that aha strike, in my ear to go look more. But um, well, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. And here is the
Yeah.
book, Moonlight
Yes.
School. So we have it at Massanutten Regional Library. We have it in multiple formats. So please check it out. But thank you again, Suzanne, for
Oh,
taking time with
my
us today.
pleasure. So enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much. I'm
All
glad it
right. Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody again. And this will be, it's been recorded. So we will put it up on our YouTube channel for a little bit. So tell your friends. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.